The clock ticked toward dusk on November 24, 1971, a Wednesday evening draped in the damp, gray chill of the Pacific Northwest. Portland, Oregon, lay under a shroud of late autumn mist, its streets slick with rain that fell in a steady, mournful rhythm. It was the day before Thanksgiving, a time when most folks were winding down, their minds drifting to turkey dinners, crackling fireplaces, and the soft clatter of family gatherings. At Portland International Airport, the terminal hummed with a subdued energy. Travelers shuffled through the check-in lines, their suitcases thumping against the linoleum floor, their voices a low murmur of holiday anticipation. The air smelled of wet wool and jet fuel, a faint tang that clung to the glass walls as rain streaked down in silvery threads. Amid this ordinary scene stepped a man who would soon shatter the quiet routine of the day, a figure so unassuming that no one spared him a second glance. He moved with a measured stride, his loafers silent against the polished floor, a slim silhouette in a dark business suit that hung neatly on his frame. His white dress shirt was crisp, its collar starched, and a narrow black tie rested against his chest like a shadow. His hair was dark, combed back with a precision that suggested habit rather than vanity, and he wore clip-on sunglasses, those cheap, practical lenses that snapped onto regular frames, giving him an air of quiet detachment. In his left hand, he carried a small black attaché case, its leather surface scuffed but polished, the kind of accessory you'd expect from a mid-level executive or a salesman crisscrossing the country on a tight budget. He was a man who could have been anyone. A tax accountant, a hardware supplier, a weary traveler heading home for the holidays. But he wasn't just anyone. He was Dan Cooper, a name scribbled on a ticket stub that would soon echo through history, misheard by a reporter as D.B. Cooper, and cemented into legend. He approached the Northwest Orient Airlines counter with the calm of a man who'd done this 100 times before. The ticket agent, a young woman with a practiced smile and a name tag that read Linda, glanced up from her clipboard. Her hair was pinned into a neat bun, her uniform a crisp blue that matched the airline's logo. "Destination?" she asked, her pen hovering over the manifest. "Seattle," he replied, his voice low and even, carrying a faint Midwestern lilt that barely registered in her busy mind. He slid $20 across the counter, exact change for a one-way ticket aboard Flight 305, a Boeing 727 scheduled to depart at 4:35 p.m. Name, she prompted, her tone mechanical. "Dan Cooper," he said, and she jotted it down, her handwriting a quick scrawl on the passenger list. She handed him the boarding pass, a flimsy slip of paper with perforated edges, and waved him toward the gate. To Linda, he was just another face in a sea of travelers, a fleeting detail in a day of endless transactions. She'd forget him by the time her shift ended, or so she thought. Flight 305 was a short hop, a mere 30-minute jaunt from Portland to Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, known to locals as Seattle-Tacoma. The plane waiting at Gate 12 was a Boeing 727-100, a workhorse of the skies in the early 1970s, its sleek fuselage painted in Northwest Orient's red and white livery. It gleamed under the terminal's floodlights, despite the drizzle that beaded on its metal skin. The 727 was a marvel of engineering, with its distinctive T-shaped tail and three Pratt & Whitney engines that growled with quiet power. But its most unique feature was the rear air stair, a hydraulic ramp that lowered from the tail, a relic of its design for quick passenger loading at small, under-equipped airports. That day, the flight was lightly booked, with only 36 passengers slated to board its 94 seats. The cabin would feel half empty, a scattering of souls dwarfed by the plane's capacity, their presence a mere whisper against its steel frame. The crew was a tight-knit team, seasoned and reliable, the kind you'd trust to navigate a storm or soothe a nervous flyer. Captain William Bill Scott, 47, sat in the left seat of the cockpit, his weathered face etched with years of flying. His hands were steady on the controls, his graying hair tucked under a pilot's cap, and his eyes carried the calm of a man who'd seen it all: turbulence, engine failures, midnight landings and fog. Beside him was First Officer Bob Radizak, a sharp-eyed co-pilot in his 30s, quick with calculations and quicker with a quip. Flight engineer H.E. Anderson, a wiry technical wizard with a toolbox of knowledge, manned the system's panel, his fingers dancing over dials and switches. In the cabin, 2 flight attendants prepared for service. Florence Schaffner, 23, with auburn hair and a warm smile that put passengers at ease, and Tina Mucklow, 22, blonde and poised, her quiet strength a steadying force. They were the human face of Flight 305, trained to handle anything from spilled coffee to airsick kids. But nothing in their training manuals could have prepared them for what was coming. Dan Cooper boarded without fanfare, his boarding pass clutched in one hand as he stepped onto the jetway. The air inside was cool and dry, tinged with the faint scent of upholstery and jet fuel. He made his way down the aisle, his steps deliberate, and settled into row 18, seat C, near the rear of the cabin. The seat was cushioned in a muted blue fabric, its armrests worn from countless elbows, and he sank into it with a sigh that might have been fatigue or anticipation. He placed his attaché case on the floor beside him, its presence as unassuming as the man himself, and adjusted his tie with a quick tug. The cabin buzzed faintly with the chatter of other passengers. Businessmen flipping through newspapers, a young couple whispering about their holiday plans, a child kicking the seat in front of him. Cooper ignored them all, his gaze drifting to the window where rain streaked the glass in wild, silvery patterns. At 4:35 p.m., the engines rumbled to life, a low growl that vibrated through the fuselage. The 727 taxied down the runway, its wheels splashing through puddles, and then lifted off with a surge of power that pressed passengers back into their seats. The plane climbed into a sky thick with storm clouds, the landscape below fading into a blur of gray and green, Oregon's forests stretching out like a dark, endless sea. Inside, the cabin settled into a quiet rhythm, the hum of conversation muted by the drone of the engines. Cooper lit a cigarette. Smoking was still permitted on flights in those days, and exhaled a thin plume of smoke that curled toward the ceiling, dissipating into the recycled air. He leaned back, his sunglasses catching the dim overhead light, and watched the world outside dissolve into the storm. To the casual observer, he was just another passenger, lost in thought, perhaps mentally drafting a memo or planning a quiet evening in Seattle. But beneath that calm exterior, a plan was unfolding, a spark waiting to ignite. Florence Schaffner began her rounds shortly after takeoff, her heels clicking softly against the carpeted aisle. She carried a tray of drinks, her smile bright and professional, a beacon of normalcy in the confined space. When she reached row 18, Cooper looked up, his face half-shadowed by the window's gloom. "Bourbon and soda," he ordered, his voice soft but clear, the Midwestern lilt more pronounced now. She nodded, her fingers brushing the edge of her notepad, and turned to the galley to prepare it. The ice clinked as she poured, the bourbon's amber glow catching the light, and she returned with the glass balanced on her tray. As she handed it to him, he reached out, his movements slow and deliberate, and pressed a folded note into her palm. His fingers brushed hers for the briefest moment, a touch as cold as the glass. Florence, accustomed to the occasional flirtatious scribble from male passengers, gave him a polite nod and slipped the note into her apron pocket, intending to glance at it later, or perhaps toss it into the trash with the empty cups. She turned to move on, her mind already on the next row, but Cooper leaned forward, his tone shifting to something firmer, more insistent. "Miss," he said, his voice cutting through the cabin's hum like a blade, "you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." The words hit her like a jolt of electricity, freezing her in place. Her breath caught, and she turned slowly, her eyes darting to his face. Behind those clip-on sunglasses, his expression was unreadable. His lips set in a thin, neutral line. He didn't look like a madman. No wild eyes, no trembling hands, no sweat beading on his brow. He was composed, almost eerily so, sipping his bourbon as if he'd just asked for an extra pillow. Florence hesitated, her pulse racing beneath her uniform, then pulled the note from her pocket with trembling fingers. She unfolded it, the paper crinkling in her grasp, and there, in neat, typed capital letters, was a message that turned her blood cold. He had a bomb in his briefcase, and he was prepared to detonate it unless his demands were met. He wanted $200,000 in unmarked $20 bills, a fortune worth over $1 million in today's terms, and 4 parachutes, 2 main chutes and 2 reserves. Failure to comply would mean the end of Flight 305, its crew, and its passengers reduced to a fireball in the stormy sky. Her knees weakened, but Florence forced herself to stay upright, her training kicking in like a reflex. She glanced at the attaché case, now a sinister presence at his feet, its black leather gleaming faintly in the cabin light. Then she looked back at him, searching for a crack in his calm, a sign he was bluffing. There was none. "I'll take this to the captain," she managed to say, her voice trembling despite her efforts to steady it. She turned and hurried toward the cockpit, her heels clicking faster now, the note clutched in her hand like a live grenade. Cooper watched her go, his posture unchanged, the cigarette smoldering between his fingers. He took another sip of bourbon, the ice clinking softly, and waited. In the cockpit, Captain Scott was monitoring the instruments, his hands resting lightly on the yoke, when Florence burst through the door. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a fear she couldn't hide. "We've got a hijacker," she said, thrusting the note at him. Scott took it, his jaw tightening as he read the typed words, each letter a punch to the gut. He handed it to Radizak, who cursed under his breath, then turned to Anderson. "Check the manual," Scott ordered, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "See if there's a protocol for this." But there wasn't, not really. Hijackings were rare in 1971, and none had unfolded with such chilling precision. Scott grabbed the radio, his fingers tightening around the mic. "Seattle Center. This is Northwest 305, he said, his tone calm but urgent. "We've got a problem. Passenger says he has a bomb. He's demanding $200,000 and parachutes. Advise." The message crackled through the airwaves, a spark that ignited a frenzy on the ground. Air traffic controllers scrambled, their voices overlapping as they relayed the alert to the FBI, Northwest Orient executives, and local law enforcement. In the cabin, Cooper sat in silence, his sunglasses reflecting the dim overhead lights like twin mirrors. He opened his attaché case just enough to show Florence, who'd returned to check on him, a glimpse of its contents. A tangle of wires, 8 red cylindrical objects that resembled dynamite, and a battery taped to the side. It was crude, almost theatrical, but it was enough to make her stomach lurch. He snapped the case shut and leaned back, crossing his legs with a casual ease that belied the chaos he'd unleashed. "Tell them to keep the plane in the air until everything's ready," he instructed, his tone as nonchalant as if he were ordering another drink. "We'll land in Seattle when I say so." Florence nodded, her mind reeling, and retreated to relay the message. The plane droned on, climbing through the storm, its fate now in the hands of a man who called himself Dan Cooper, a name that would soon become synonymous with mystery, daring, and the impossible. Outside, the rain lashed the windows, the clouds swallowed the horizon, and the night closed in, a perfect stage for the drama about to unfold. The Boeing 727 of Northwest Orient Flight 305 didn't streak toward Seattle like a bird on a mission. Instead, it carved slow, deliberate circles in the stormy sky above the city, a ghostly silhouette swallowed by the roiling clouds that blanketed the Pacific Northwest. It was November 24, 1971, just past 4:45 p.m., and the rain lashed the fuselage in relentless sheets, streaking the windows with wild, silvery trails. Captain William Scott had adjusted the altitude to 10,000 feet, as Dan Cooper demanded, low enough to keep the cabin unpressurized. A technical quirk that hinted at the hijackers' unsettling familiarity with aviation. The engines thrummed with a steady, mournful hum, burning fuel at a prodigious rate, while the storm outside raged with a fury that matched the tension brewing within. Inside, the cabin was a fragile bubble of light and sound, its 36 passengers still blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding at the rear, their voices a faint murmur against the roar of wind and machinery. In row 18, seat C, Dan Cooper sat alone, a solitary figure bathed in the soft, flickering glow of the overhead lights. His black attaché case rested at his feet, a Pandora's box of wires and threats, its leather surface gleaming faintly as if mocking the innocence of the scene. On the tray table before him sat his bourbon and soda, half finished, the ice melting into a watery puddle that sloshed with each gentle bank of the plane. Florence Schaffner and Tina Mucklow, the two flight attendants, hovered nearby, their movements careful, their eyes darting between Cooper and the cockpit door. Florence had seen the alleged bomb. A tangle of wires, 8 red sticks that looked like dynamite, a battery taped crudely to the side, and the image burned in her mind like a brand. It was enough to make her hands tremble, though she hid it behind a mask of professionalism. Cooper, for his part, remained a study in calm, an enigma in a dark suit and clip-on sunglasses. He lit another cigarette, the flame flaring briefly against his face, and exhaled a slow stream of smoke that drifted upward, curling into the cabin's recycled air. "No need to panic," he told Tina, who'd taken a seat across the aisle at his quiet insistence. "Just do what I say, and everyone gets to go home for Thanksgiving." His words hung in the air, a cold comfort that did little to ease the knot in Tina's stomach. She was 22, slender and blonde, with a steady gaze that belied the fear clawing at her insides. She'd been trained for emergencies, fires, turbulence, passengers clutching their chests in mid-flight, but nothing in the Northwest Orient Handbook covered a hijacker with a bomb. She nodded mutely, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her uniform skirt creased from the tension of sitting still. Florence, meanwhile, shuttled between the cabin and the cockpit, her heels clicking faster now, relaying Cooper's instructions with a voice that trembled only slightly. "He says to circle until the money and parachutes are ready," she told Captain Scott, who nodded grimly and adjusted the flight path yet again. The plane banked gently to the left, its wings slicing through the turbulent air, as the crew settled into a holding pattern that stretched minutes into an agonizing eternity. In the cockpit, Scott gripped the yoke with a steady hand, his weathered face set in a mask of concentration. He'd flown through worse, blizzards over the Rockies, fog so thick you couldn't see the wingtips. But this was a different beast. "Keep her steady," he muttered to First Officer Bob Radizak, who monitored the instruments with hawk-like precision. The altimeter held at 10,000 feet, the airspeed a sluggish 170 knots. The flaps extended to 15 degrees as Cooper had ordered. Flight engineer H.E. Anderson hunched over the system's panel, his wiry frame tense as he tracked the fuel gauges creeping toward the red. "We can't keep this up forever," he warned, his voice a low growl. "We're burning through gas like it's water." Scott nodded, his jaw tight. "Tell him that when he's got a bomb strapped to his chest," he replied, then keyed the radio. "Seattle Center, Northwest 305. We're still circling. Hijacker's comm says he's got a bomb." Showed it to the stewardess. "What's the word on the ground?" The response crackled through the headset, a lifeline in the chaos. "FBI's on it," the controller said, his voice clipped. "Money and chutes are being assembled. Stand by." Scott exhaled, a slow breath that fogged the cockpit window, and glanced at Radizak. "He's too damn cool about this," he said. "Like he's done it before." Radizak shrugged, his eyes never leaving the dials. "Or he's crazy enough to think he can pull it off." The plane droned on, its path a hypnotic spiral above Seattle, a dance with the storm that seemed to stretch time itself. Below, at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, the scene was anything but calm. The terminal buzzed with frantic activity, a hive of black sedans, police cruisers, and Northwest Orient vans converging under the rain-soaked tarmac lights. Special Agent Ralph Himmelsbach, a wiry man with a reputation for dogged persistence, took charge, his trench coat flapping as he paced the operations room. Rain plastered his dark hair to his forehead, but his eyes burned with focus. "Get me NIROP on the line," he barked into a radio, his voice cutting through the chatter of agents and airline staff. "We need that money now." Donald NIROP, Northwest Orient's president, was roused from his office in Minneapolis, his Thanksgiving plans evaporating as the call came through. "Pay it," he said over the crackling line, his tone firm and final. "We're not risking 42 lives over cash. The insurance will cover it. Just get it done." The money was the trickiest part. $200,000 in unmarked $20 bills. A staggering 10,000 notes that weighed over 20 pounds. It wasn't the kind of sum you could pull from a bank teller's drawer, especially not on the eve of a holiday when vaults were locked tight. Rainier National Bank, a local institution, was enlisted, its manager dragged from a pre-Thanksgiving dinner to unlock the safe. Inside, tellers worked in a blur, their hands trembling as they stacked bills into neat bundles, each note photographed by an FBI technician for its serial number, a precaution to track the cash if Cooper ever dared to spend it. The bills were unmarked, as he demanded, but the serial numbers all began with L, issued by the San Francisco Federal Reserve, a detail that would later haunt the investigation like a ghost. The stacks were stuffed into a canvas sack, it seemed straining under the weight, and loaded into a van that screeched towards Seattle-Tacoma, its tires kicking up sprays of water. The parachutes were another puzzle, a request that raised eyebrows among the agents huddled in the rain. Cooper had specified 2 civilian main chutes and 2 military-style reserves, a demand that suggested he knew more than the average passenger about skydiving or survival. The civilian chutes were sourced from a skydiving school in Issaquah, a small town east of Seattle, where instructors folded their nylon canopies with care, their hands steady despite the urgency. "He's planning to jump," one muttered, shaking his head as he handed over the gear. The reserves came from McCord Air Force Base, 40 miles south, older models with chest straps and ripcords, less forgiving than modern designs. One of them, in the rush of the moment, was a dummy, a training chute sewn shut, useless for a real jump. It was a mistake, a cruel twist of fate slipped into the pile, but no one noticed as the parachutes were bundled into a duffel bag and raced to the airport. Back in the sky, the plane circled relentlessly, its fuel reserves dwindling with each loop. Scott radioed updates to the ground, his voice a steady anchor in the storm. "He's still calm," he reported. "Says he's got everything under control. We're not taking chances." Air traffic controllers kept other planes at a distance, clearing a wide swath of airspace around Flight 305, their radar screens glowing with the lone blip of the hijacked jet. Lightning flickered in the distance, a jagged slash against the black, a dramatic backdrop to the unfolding drama. Inside, Cooper chatted with Tina, his tone almost conversational, a surreal contrast to the stakes. "You ever been to Seattle?" he asked at one point, flicking ash from his cigarette onto the carpet. She shook her head, her throat too tight to speak. "Nice city," he said, his lips twitching into a faint smile. "Too bad I won't be staying." At 5:24 p.m., a crackle broke the cockpit's tension. "Northwest 305. This is Seattle Center. Money and parachutes are ready at Seattle-Tacoma. Awaiting your instructions." Scott relayed the news to Cooper via the intercom, his voice steady despite the sweat beading on his brow. The hijacker gave a curt nod, his sunglasses glinting in the dim light. "Land it," he said, his tone as casual as if he were ordering a taxi. At 5:39 p.m., Flight 305 descended through the storm, its landing gear thudding onto the Seattle-Tacoma tarmac with a jolt that rattled the cabin. Cooper had instructed the pilots to taxi to a remote corner of the airport, far from the terminal's glow, and keep the engines running. The cabin lights were dimmed, the window shades drawn, another of his demands, thwarting any snipers who might be lurking in the shadows with rifles trained on the plane. Through the cockpit window, Scott could see flashing lights in the distance. A perimeter of police and FBI vehicles, their beams cutting through the rain, held at bay by the threat of that unseen bomb. A lone airline employee, Al Lee, was chosen to deliver the ransom. He was a wiry man in his 30s, his rain-soaked jacket clinging to his frame as he approached the plane, his hands trembling under the weight of the canvas sack and the duffel bag of parachutes. Cooper lowered the rear air stair with a hydraulic whine, the wind rushing in with a howl that drowned out the engine's roar, a cold blast that whipped at Tina's hair. Lee climbed aboard, his breath visible in the frigid air, and set the loot at Cooper's feet, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and disbelief. The hijacker inspected it with a meticulous eye, running his fingers over the stacks of bills, flipping through them to ensure they were unmarked, their edges crisp despite the hurried assembly. He tugged at the parachute cords, checking their integrity, his movements precise and unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. Satisfied, he made a decision that stunned the crew. "Go," he told Florence, gesturing toward the air stair with a flick of his cigarette. "Take them with you." One by one, the 36 passengers filed out, their faces a gallery of confusion and relief as they stumbled into the rain, their coats flapping in the wind. Mothers clutched children, businessmen gripped briefcases, all of them blinking in the glare of police lights as FBI agents whisked them away for questioning. Florence went with them, her legs shaky but her head held high, her apron pocket still crinkling with the weight of that first note. The air stair word shut behind her, sealing the plane once more, but Cooper wasn't alone. He kept Captain Scott, Radizak, Anderson, and Tina Mucklow on board, their presence a tether to his next move. "Close the door," he told Tina, pointing to the air stair controls with a gloved hand. "We're not done flying yet." She obeyed, her fingers fumbling with the lever, the ramp locking into place with a metallic thud. Cooper settled back into his seat, the sack of cash at his side, the parachutes stacked nearby like silent sentinels. He lit another cigarette, the smoke curling around him like a shroud, and gazed out the window at the storm-swept tarmac. The dance above Seattle was over, a tense waltz of circling wings and whispered threats, but the real performance, the one that would etch his name into legend, was about to begin. The engines growled, the plane trembled, and Dan Cooper waited, a shadow poised on the edge of the abyss. The cabin of Northwest Orient Flight 305 felt like a hollowed-out shell as the last of the passengers disappeared down the rear air stair into the rain-soaked night of November 24, 1971. The clock on the Boeing 727's instrument panel ticked past 7:30 p.m., and the storm outside showed no mercy, its gusts rocking the plane as it sat on the remote tarmac of Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. The engines idled with a low, restless growl, their vibrations pulsing through the fuselage, a constant reminder of the stakes that hung in the air. Dan Cooper stood at the rear, his silhouette framed by the dim cabin lights, a lone figure in a dark suit and clip-on sunglasses that caught the faint glow like twin mirrors. At his feet lay the spoils of his audacious gambit, a canvas sack bulging with $200,000 in unmarked $20 bills and 4 parachutes, 2 civilian mains and 2 military reserves, stacked in a haphazard pile. The air was thick with the scent of cigarette smoke and jet fuel, a bitter tang that mingled with the cold wind seeping through the cracks. In the cockpit, Captain William Scott sat rigid, his hands resting on the yoke, his weathered face etched with a mix of exhaustion and resolve. First Officer Bob Radizak monitored the instruments, his sharp eyes flicking between the altimeter and the fuel gauges, while Flight Engineer H.E. Anderson hunched over the system's panel, his fingers poised over switches that could do little to alter their fate. Tina Mucklow, the lone flight attendant still aboard, lingered near the galley, her blonde hair disheveled from the wind that had rushed in when the air stair opened. She watched Cooper with a mixture of dread and fascination. This man who held their lives in his gloved hands, yet spoke with the calm of a seasoned traveler planning a weekend getaway. The passengers were gone, their absence leaving the cabin eerily quiet, but the tension had only thickened, coiling around the remaining crew like a snake ready to strike. Cooper's voice crackled through the intercom, cutting through the hum of the engines with a chilling clarity. "Take off," he said, his tone steady and commanding. "We're flying to Mexico City. Keep it low, 10,000 feet, flaps at 15 degrees, landing gear down, airspeed below 200 knots. Scott's brow furrowed as he processed the instructions, his mind racing through the implications. The Boeing 727 wasn't built for such a flight profile. It would guzzle fuel like a thirsty beast, and Mexico City lay over 2,000 miles south, far beyond the plane's range without a stop. He keyed the intercom, his voice measured but firm. "We can't make it that far on one tank," he said. "We'll need to refuel somewhere." There was a pause, a crackle of static, and then Cooper's reply came, as casual as if he were negotiating a dinner reservation. Fine. Reno, Nevada. We'll stop there. At 7:40 p.m., the engines roared to full power, and Flight 305 lifted off from Seattle-Tacoma, its wheels splashing through puddles before retracting with a thud. The plane climbed into the stormy night, leveling off at 10,000 feet as ordered. Its flaps and landing gear extended in a configuration that made it lumber through the sky like a wounded bird. The rear air stair remained partially lowered at Cooper's insistence, a cold wind whistling through the gap, tugging at the curtains and sending loose papers skittering across the floor. Tina strapped herself into a jump seat near the galley, her hands gripping the armrests, her eyes fixed on Cooper as he prepared for whatever came next. He moved with a deliberate grace, his loafers silent on the carpet as he opened the canvas sack and pulled out stacks of $20 bills. The money, 10,000 notes, weighing over 20 pounds, rustled in his hands, their edges crisp despite the hurried assembly on the ground. He grabbed a length of parachute cord from one of the chutes, its nylon fibers rough against his gloves, and began tying the stacks around his waist, knotting them tightly to form a makeshift belt. The weight pulled at his frame, but he adjusted his stance, undeterred, his movements methodical and precise. Next, he turned to the parachutes, his fingers tracing the straps of a civilian main chute, a bright splash of nylon against the cabin's muted blues and grays. He slipped it onto his back, the harness settling over his shoulders with a faint creak, and adjusted the straps with a practiced ease that suggested he'd done this before. Perhaps in a past life as a soldier, a skydiver, or something darker. He tugged at the cords, ensuring they were snug, then pulled on a pair of leather gloves, their surface worn but supple, flexing his fingers to test the fit. Tina watched, her heart pounding in her chest, the wind's howl a constant roar in her ears. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice barely audible over the gale, a desperate plea born of instinct. "It's not too late to stop." Cooper turned to her, and for a fleeting moment, his sunglasses slipped, revealing dark eyes that held no fear, only a steely determination that chilled her to the bone. "I know what I'm doing," he replied, his lips curling into a thin, knowing smile. "Don't worry about me, miss." He moved to the rear air stair, his hand reaching for the lever that controlled its hydraulic system. With a firm pull, he lowered it fully, and the cabin erupted with sound. A deafening roar as the storm rushed in, the wind tearing at his coat and tie, whipping the black fabric into a frenzy. The plane shuddered, its aerodynamics disrupted by the open ramp, but Scott held it steady, his hands white-knuckled on the yoke. Outside, the night was a void of black, broken only by jagged flashes of lightning that illuminated the churning clouds below. Flight 305 was flying over southwestern Washington now, a rugged expanse of forest and rivers stretching beneath them, its terrain hidden by darkness and rain. The altimeter hovered at 10,000 feet, the airspeed a sluggish 170 knots, the plane's path tracing a line through the wilderness known as Victor 23 by air traffic control, a corridor of no return for the man in row 18. Tina unbuckled herself and edged closer, her hands clutching the seatbacks for balance as the wind buffeted her. "Please," she shouted, her voice lost in the gale, her eyes pleading with him to reconsider. "You'll die out there." But Cooper didn't flinch. He stepped onto the air stair, the metal slick with rain, and gripped the railing with one gloved hand, his attaché case clutched in the other. The money was lashed to his body, the parachute strapped tight, his suit flapping wildly in the wind like a flag of defiance. He glanced back at Tina, that faint smile still playing on his lips, a flicker of something. Amusement, resolve, or perhaps farewell. Then he turned to the abyss, his body poised on the edge of the ramp, a shadow against the storm. The clock in the cockpit ticked past 8 p.m., though no one could pinpoint the exact moment. Somewhere between 8 o'clock and 8:13, as later reports would estimate, a window of time that would haunt investigators for decades. The wind screamed, the plane trembled, and then, with a single decisive step, Dan Cooper leapt into the night. The pilots felt it instantly. A sudden jolt, a pressure bump, as the air stair snapped upward, freed of his weight, its hydraulics whining in protest. Scott glanced at Radazak, his breath catching in his throat. "He's gone," Anderson said, his voice a mix of disbelief and relief, his eyes darting to the air stair indicator light that blinked erratically on the panel. Radazak nodded, his hands steady on the controls. "Crazy bastard actually did it." Tina stumbled back to the cabin, her legs shaky as she peered into the emptiness. Row 18 was vacant, the seat cushion slightly askew from where he'd risen. On the tray table sat his bourbon and soda, the ice melted into a watery ring, a silent testament to his presence. Beside it lay a black clip-on tie, its knot loosened as if discarded in haste, the fabric fluttering faintly in the draft. The money, the parachutes, the man himself, all had vanished into the storm, swallowed by the darkness beyond the open ramp. She sank into a seat, her hands trembling, her mind reeling with the impossibility of what she'd just witnessed. "He's gone," she whispered, the words lost to the wind. The plane droned on, its fuel reserves dwindling as it plowed through the night toward Reno, Nevada. Scott adjusted the course, his voice steady as he radioed air traffic control. "Seattle Center, Northwest 305. Hijackers jumped. We're heading for Reno. ETA 10:15. The controller's response was a garbled mix of shock and instructions, but the crew barely heard it, their focus on keeping the plane aloft. At 10:15 p.m., Flight 305 touched down at Reno Tahoe International Airport, its tanks nearly dry, the landing gear thudding onto the tarmac with a jolt that echoed through the empty cabin. FBI agents stormed aboard, their flashlights sweeping the shadows, guns drawn for a confrontation that never came. They found a ghost ship. No hijacker, no bomb, just a scattering of cigarette butts. 8 Raleigh filters smoked to stubs, and that lone tie, a relic of the man who'd been there moments before. Special Agent Ralph Himmelsbach led the charge, his trench coat dripping as he climbed the air stair, his eyes narrowing at the scene. "He's gone," Tina told him, her voice hollow, her hands still clutching the seat back. Himmelsbach nodded, his jaw tight, and stepped into the cabin, his flashlight beam lingering on the tie, the glass, the empty row. The rear air stair hung open, swinging faintly in the breeze, a silent witness to the escape. The agents fanned out, their boots clomping on the carpet, searching for clues that weren't there. Cooper had done the unthinkable. He'd hijacked a plane, extorted a fortune, and leapt into the unknown, leaving nothing but echoes in his wake. Outside, the rain pounded the tarmac, the storm a fitting shroud for the mystery unfolding. Himmelsbach stepped back into the night, his radio crackling with orders to mobilize a search. "He's out there," he muttered, his breath fogging in the cold, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Dead or alive, we'll find him." The air stair was raised, the plane secured, and the agents retreated, their faces grim with the weight of what lay ahead. Dan Cooper had vanished, a shadow swallowed by the storm, and the greatest escape in aviation history had just begun. The hunt for D.B. Cooper, the name the world would soon know him by, was about to consume the nation. A chase that would stretch across years and continents, chasing a ghost who danced with the wind and won. The dawn of November 25, 1971, broke over the Pacific Northwest with a cold, gray pallor, the storm that had cloaked Dan Cooper's audacious escape still lingering in the air like a vengeful specter. Thanksgiving morning arrived not with the warmth of holiday cheer but with the sharp bite of frost and the distant rumble of thunder, a fitting requiem for the chaos that had unfolded the night before. At Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, there was no trace of celebration, only the frenetic hum of activity as FBI agents, local police, and airline officials gathered in a tense huddle on the tarmac, their breath fogging in the frigid air. Flight 305 sat silent in Reno, Nevada, its rear air stair locked shut, its cabin a hollow shell stripped of its hijacker. Dan Cooper, or D.B. Cooper, as a reporter's misheard name would soon brand him, had leapt into the stormy night, vanishing with $200,000 and a parachute, leaving behind a plane full of questions and a nation on edge. The greatest manhunt in American history was underway, and the clock was ticking. Special Agent Ralph Himmelsbach stood at the center of the storm, his lean frame pacing the airport's operations room as the first light crept through the rain-streaked windows. A veteran of the FBI's Portland field office, Himmelsbach was a wiry man with a hawkish gaze and a reputation for tenacity, the kind of agent who'd chase a lead to the ends of the earth. His trench coat was soaked, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, but his voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "He's out there," he told his team, jabbing a finger at a map pinned to the wall, its edges curling from the damp. "Dead or alive, we're going to find him." The map outlined Cooper's presumed drop zone, a rugged swath of wilderness in southwestern Washington between the tiny logging towns of Ariel and Woodland, bordered to the south by the mighty Columbia River. Known as Victor 23 in air traffic control parlance, it spanned roughly 28 square miles. A labyrinth of towering Douglas firs, steep ravines and swollen streams, all shrouded in a fog so thick it seemed to swallow sound itself. The conditions were nothing short of brutal. Temperatures hovered in the low 20s Fahrenheit, the wind gusting up to 30 miles per hour, driving sheets of freezing rain across the landscape like icy daggers. The forest floor was a quagmire of mud and snow, its roots slick with ice, its branches heavy with the weight of the storm. If Cooper had survived his jump, and that was a big if, he'd landed in a natural fortress, a terrain so unforgiving that even seasoned trappers and hunters steered clear in winter. The FBI had calculated his trajectory based on the plane's speed, altitude, and the timing of the pressure bump felt by the pilots, sometime between 8 o'clock and 8:13 p.m., but it was a rough guess at best. He'd leapt from 10,000 feet into 200-knot winds, wearing only a business suit, loafers, and a parachute with no helmet, no survival gear, and a 20-pound sack of cash strapped to his waist. The odds were stacked against him, a gambler's bet against nature itself, but Cooper had already defied the odds once by pulling off the hijacking. No one was ready to write him off. Not yet. Helicopters took to the skies at first light, their rotors slicing through the mist as searchlights swept the forest canopy in frantic arcs. The choppers buzzed like angry hornets, their engines a dull roar against the wind, their pilots squinting through fogged visors for any sign of a parachute or a crumpled figure in the trees. On the ground, teams fanned out from Ariel, a speck of a town near Lake Merwin where loggers and fishermen swapped tales over coffee. The searchers wore heavy coats and waterproof boots, their faces red from the cold, their hands clutching radios, flashlights, and rifles. Not because they expected a fight, but because the wilderness held its own dangers. Black bears roused from hibernation, cougars stalking the shadows, and the ever-present risk of hypothermia that could claim a man in hours. "Look for anything," Himmelsbach instructed over the radio, his voice crackling with static. A parachute snagged in the branches, a shred of that damn suit, a bill fluttering in the wind. He didn't just vanish, but the forest gave up nothing. The trees stood like sentinels, their trunks slick with moss, their needles carpeting the ground in a thick, sodden layer that muffled footsteps and hid secrets. Searchers trudged through knee-deep mud, their boots sinking with each step, their flashlights casting eerie beams that danced among the shadows. They climbed ravines, their hands slipping on icy rocks, and peered into hollows where the wind howled like a banshee. The canopy above was a tangled web, so dense that even the helicopter's lights struggled to penetrate it, their beams reflecting off wet leaves in a kaleidoscope of green and gray. "It's like looking for a needle in a haystack," one agent muttered, wiping rain from his brow. "A haystack that wants to kill you." The Columbia River became a focal point, its dark waters churning with the fury of November rains. If Cooper had landed in or near it, the current, swift, cold, and relentless, could have swept him away like a leaf in a torrent. Divers plunged into its depths, their wetsuits barely shielding them from the numbing chill, their oxygen tanks hissing as they descended into the murk. Boats dragged nets along the banks, their engines straining against the flow, their crews scanning the surface for any glint of nylon or a flash of green from a $20 bill. The water was a muddy brown, its depths cloaked in sediment, and visibility was near zero. "He could be at the bottom," one diver reported, surfacing with a shiver, his lips blue from the cold. "Or he could have washed downstream miles from here, Canada even." The river stretched over 1,200 miles, a vast, winding artery that mocked their efforts with its sheer scale. Days passed with no yield, nothing but driftwood, fish bones, and the occasional rusted can snagged in the nets. Back at FBI headquarters in Seattle, agents pored over the scant evidence from the plane, their desks buried under maps, reports, and coffee cups stained with sleepless nights. The black clip-on tie, left on seat 18C, was sent to the lab, its fibers teased apart under microscopes for traces of hair, sweat, or anything that might betray its owner. The cigarette butts, 8 Raleigh filters, smoked down to stubs, were collected in plastic bags, their tips stained with faint traces of lipstick-like residue, though DNA analysis was decades away. The bourbon glass bore smudged fingerprints, but they were too faint to lift cleanly, a frustrating blur of whorls and ridges. The crew and passengers were interviewed exhaustively, their memories mined for every detail, no matter how small. Florence Schaffner described Cooper as polite but firm, estimating him at 5 feet 10 inches to 6 foot tall, around 170 pounds, with dark hair and a receding hairline hidden beneath those sunglasses. Tina Mucklow added that he'd seemed confident, not nervous, her voice soft as she recalled his Midwestern lilt and the way he'd sipped his drink like a man with no worries. A composite sketch emerged from their accounts. A bland, middle-aged face with a square jaw and dark eyes. A portrait so generic it could have been 1,000 men or none. It was plastered across newspapers and TV screens by noon, a ghostly image that taunted investigators with its vagueness. The money offered a glimmer of hope, a lifeline in the sea of uncertainty. The $10,020 bills had been cataloged before delivery, their serial numbers starting with L, and meticulously recorded by FBI technicians at Rainier National Bank. Himmelsbach ordered lists distributed to banks, casinos, gas stations, and stores across the country, urging tellers and clerks to watch for them like hawks. "If he spends a dime, we'll have him," he vowed, slamming a fist on the table, his eyes burning with determination. The bills were unmarked as Cooper had demanded, but traceable, a trap set to snare him if he dared to break cover. But as days turned to weeks, then months, not a single bill surfaced in circulation. The silence was deafening, a void that gnawed at the agent's resolve. Had he stashed the cash in a hollow tree, its roots curling around the canvas sack? Buried it under a rock in some forgotten clearing? Lost it in the jump, the bills scattering like leaves in the wind? Or was he dead, the money strapped to his corpse, claimed by the forest or the river? Theories about his fate multiplied like wildfire, whispered over radios and debated in smoky briefing rooms. Some agents believed he'd perished, a victim of the storm, the altitude, or his own hubris. The parachute he'd taken was a civilian model, manageable in theory, but one of the reserves was a dummy, sewn shut and useless, a cruel oversight from McCord Air Force Base. Had he grabbed the wrong one in the dark, plummeting to his doom? The jump itself was a death-defying gamble. 10,000 feet into 200-knot winds, with no visibility, a landing zone of jagged trees, cliffs, and icy streams. No sane man would try it, a military paratrooper told the press, shaking his head. He's fish food in the Columbia, or a smear on a hillside. But others weren't so sure. Cooper's calm, his specific demands, 10,000 feet, unpressurized cabin, for parachutes, suggested a man who knew more than the average passenger. Was he a paratrooper trained to jump under fire? A pilot with a death wish? A mad genius who'd calculated every move? "He's too smart to die like that," one agent argued, tapping the sketch. "He's out there, laughing at us." As 1971 bled into 1972, the manhunt scaled back, its fervor dimming with each fruitless day. The helicopters were grounded, their fuel costs too high, their pilots too weary. The divers were recalled, their wetsuits hung to dry, their reports a litany of nothing. Ground teams trudged back to aerial, their boots caked with mud, their faces etched with defeat. The forest grew quiet again, its secrets locked tight, its branches swaying in the wind like a taunt. Himmelsbach kept the case file on his desk, a growing stack of reports, maps, and dead ends that he thumbed through late into the night. "He's out there," he'd mutter, staring at the sketch, the tie, the cigarette butts, his voice a mix of conviction and exhaustion. Dead or alive, he's out there. The hunt for D.B. Cooper had only begun, but already it was clear. This was no ordinary criminal, and this was no ordinary chase. The wilderness of Victor 23 held its silence. The Columbia River flowed on, and the man who'd leapt from Flight 305 remained a ghost. A shadow in a suit, a riddle wrapped in a storm. The FBI packed up their gear, their radios falling silent, but the questions lingered, sharp and unyielding. Had he soared to freedom, a mastermind one step ahead, or plummeted to his doom, a fool undone by his own daring? The answers lay somewhere in the vast, untamed dark, waiting to be found or lost forever. Nearly a decade had slipped by since Dan Cooper leapt from Northwest Orient Flight 305 into the stormy night of November 24, 1971, vanishing with $200,000 and a parachute into the wilds of the Pacific Northwest. By February 1980, his name had faded into a whisper on the wind, a half-remembered tale swapped over beers in logging towns or murmured in the halls of the FBI's Portland field office. The $200,000, 10,000 unmarked $20 bills, remained unspent, its serial numbers a silent taunt to investigators who'd once dreamed of catching him through a careless transaction at a gas station or a casino. The forest of southwestern Washington had reclaimed its stillness, its Douglas firs standing tall and mute, while the Columbia River flowed on, its dark waters burying secrets in their depths. The world had moved forward, the hijacking relegated to a footnote in yellowing case files that gathered dust on steel shelves. But on February 10, 1980, a spark reignited the mystery, pulling D.B. Cooper. The name the press had cemented into legend, back into the spotlight with a discovery as tantalizing as it was confounding. It happened on a cold, clear Sunday along the Columbia River, near a sandy stretch known as Tenna Bar, about 20 miles downstream from Vancouver, Washington. The air was crisp, the sky a pale blue streaked with wisps of cloud, and the river lapped gently at the shore, its surface glinting in the winter sun like a sheet of polished glass. Brian Ingram, an 8-year-old boy with a mop of brown hair and a boundless curiosity, was camping with his family, a weekend escape from their modest home in Vancouver. His parents, Harold and Dwayne, had pitched a tent near the water's edge, the kind of spot where the city's hum faded into the rustle of wind through the trees. Brian, armed with a stick and a child's restless energy, decided to dig a fire pit in the sand, his small hands scooping away damp layers of earth as he hummed a tune under his breath. His stick hit something solid, a bundle, soft and crumbling, buried just beneath the surface. He tugged it free, brushing off the sand with grubby fingers, and stared in awe. It was money, stacks of $20 bills, their edges frayed and waterlogged, the ink faded but still legible under the sunlight. "Dad!" he shouted, his voice piercing the quiet, waving the find in the air like a trophy. Harold Ingram, a burly man in a faded flannel jacket, trudged over from the tent, his boots crunching on the gravelly shore. He took the bills from Brian's outstretched hands, his eyes widening as he ran a callous thumb over the damp paper. They were old, their texture brittle, held together by rubber bands that snapped like dry twigs at the slightest touch. He counted 3 stacks, each with about 100 bills, though some had disintegrated into a mushy pulp, their corners curling inward. "What the hell?" he muttered, flipping through them, his brow furrowing as he noticed the faint green of Treasury ink. Dwayne joined him, her scarf fluttering in the breeze, and peered over his shoulder. "That's real money," she said, her voice a mix of disbelief and excitement. Harold stuffed the bills into a plastic bag, his mind racing with possibilities. Lost loot, a drug drop, something stranger. "This could be big," he told her, his eyes darting to the river as if it might cough up more. They drove home that evening, the money tucked under the front seat of their pickup, and the next day, Harold dialed the FBI, his hands shaky as he gripped the receiver. Agents arrived within hours, their black sedans kicking up gravel as they screeched into the Ingram's driveway, a quiet suburban street still dusted with frost. Special Agent John Pringle, a grizzled veteran who'd worked the Cooper case in its early days, led the team, his trench coat flapping as he strode to the door. Harold handed over the plastic bag, its contents spilling onto the kitchen table in a soggy heap. Pringle examined the bills with a magnifying glass, his pulse quickening as he traced the serial numbers, faint but legible, against a worn list from 1971, its pages creased from years of handling. L 1969, he read aloud, his voice tight with a thrill he hadn't felt in years. They matched $5, $800 of the original $200,000, a fraction of the ransom, but the first hard evidence since Cooper's leap. It's his, Pringle said, slamming the list down, his eyes blazing with a renewed fire. It's Cooper's money. The discovery sent shockwaves through the FBI, a jolt that roused the slumbering case from its decade-long dormancy. Tennebar became a crime scene overnight, cordoned off with yellow tape that fluttered in the wind, its sandy shore swarming with agents in dark jackets and boots. Brian, wide-eyed and thrilled, watched from a distance as men with shovels and metal detectors descended, his fire pit now a footnote in history. The bills were rushed to the lab in Seattle, where technicians confirmed their authenticity. The serial numbers aligned perfectly with the ransom cataloged at Rainier National Bank, each L, a silent scream from 1971. The rubber bands, though decayed, held a clue. They were intact but brittle, suggesting the stacks had been buried for years, undisturbed until Brian's stick broke their repose. This changes everything, Pringle told his team, his voice echoing in the makeshift command post set up in a nearby diner. He was here, or his money was. The FBI dug into Tennebar with a fervor that rivaled the initial manhunt, their shovels clanging against rocks and roots as they sifted the sand inch by inch. Metal detectors buzzed and beeped, their operators sweeping the shore for more bills. A parachute, a shred of that dark suit. Anything to tie the find to Cooper's fate. The riverbank was scoured, its reeds parted by gloved hands, its pebbles overturned in a desperate bid for answers. Brian's family stood by, their camping trip forgotten, their faces a mix of awe and unease as the scene unfolded. The press caught wind by midday, their vans clogging the narrow road to Tennebar, cameras panning the desolate shore as reporters shouted questions over the wind. Boy digs up hijacker's haul. The headlines would scream the next morning, splashing Brian's gap-toothed grin across front pages from Portland to New York. But the find raised more questions than it answered, a maddening puzzle that deepened the enigma. Tennebar lay 20 miles from Cooper's presumed drop zone near Ariel, a distance that defied the neat trajectories drawn by FBI analysts in 1971. Had the money drifted downstream, carried by the Columbia's currents over years of floods and tides? Been buried by Cooper and washed up later, exposed by erosion? The bills were found just 3 feet from the water's edge, in a layer of sand that geologists later dated to post-1974, hinting at a natural deposit rather than a deliberate stash. Hydrologists were called in, their charts and models tracing the river's flow from November 1971 to February 1980. The Columbia was a beast, swift, deep, and unpredictable, its tributaries weaving through the wilderness like veins, its floods reshaping the banks with each season. It's possible, one expert concluded, peering at a map stained with coffee rings, but unlikely. The money would have spread out, not stayed in neat stacks like that. The FBI pressed harder, their efforts doubling as the days stretched into weeks. They excavated Tennebar until the sand gave way to clay, their tools scraping against the earth in a rhythm of frustration. The river was dragged again, divers plunging into its icy depths, their lights piercing the murk as they searched for more bills, a parachute, a body, anything to anchor the clue. The water yielded nothing but silt and tangled weeds, its currents mocking their labor with a relentless churn. The $5,800, 290 bills to be exact, was all they had, a tantalizing fragment of the $200,000 that had vanished with Cooper. The rest, $194, 200, remained lost, its fate as elusive as the man who'd leapt with it into the night. Theories erupted like wildfire, debated in the diner's vinyl booths and scribbled on napkins stained with grease. Some agents saw the money as proof Cooper had died, the cash torn free as he crashed through the trees or sank into the Columbia's depths. He hit hard, Ralph Himmelsbach speculated, now retired but drawn back to the case like a moth to flame. The parachute failed or he drowned, and the current carried a piece of the loot here over time. Others argued he'd survived, stashing most of the money and losing a small portion to the elements, a careless slip or a calculated decoy. He's too smart to lose it all, Pringle countered, pacing the command post, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. This is a red herring or an accident. He's out there somewhere. The rubber bands fueled the debate. Intact but brittle, they suggested the bills had been buried soon after the jump, not floating free for years. Had Cooper landed, hidden the cash in a shallow grave, and walked away, only to have nature betray his secret? The public seized on the find with a fervor that rivaled the hijacking itself, turning Brian into an overnight sensation. The Cooper Kid, the press dubbed him, their cameras flashing as he stood shyly beside his parents, his stick now a relic in the family's garage. Newspapers ran wild with speculation. Did Boy solve D.B. Cooper mystery? While TV crews flocked to Tenna Bar, their anchors intoning gravely over footage of the sandy shore. The Ingrams were thrust into the spotlight, their quiet life appended by a discovery they couldn't have foreseen. The FBI kept most of the money as evidence, its stacks locked in a vault, but after years of legal wrangling, Brian was awarded 14 bills in 1986, a $280 souvenir he'd later sell at auction for thousands. I just wanted a fire, he'd laugh in interviews decades later, a grown man by then, still marveling at his brush with legend. For the FBI, Tenna Bar was a maddening clue, a piece of the puzzle that didn't fit the frame they'd built. They returned to the drop zone near Ariel, re-examining flight data, wind patterns, and witness accounts with fresh eyes. The money's condition suggested it hadn't traveled far, its stacks too intact for a 9-year drift, yet its location 20 miles downstream defied the math of Victor 23. He's still out there, Pringle muttered, echoing Himmelsbach's old refrain, his voice heavy with frustration as he stared at the lab reports. Or his ghost is laughing at us. The discovery breathed new life into the case, a jolt of adrenaline that pulsed through the agency. But it also deepened the enigma, turning D.B. Cooper into a riddle wrapped in a river's embrace. The Columbia flowed on, its waters glinting in the winter sun, its secrets buried deeper than any diver could reach. The forest stood silent, its shadows stretching long and dark, and the $5,800 sat in evidence, a taunting relic of a man who defied the odds. The hunt flared briefly, then flickered, its momentum stalled by the same questions that had haunted it since 1971. Had Cooper lived, slipping away with his fortune, or died, his bones scattered among the pines, his loot lost to time? Tenna Bar offered no answers, only whispers, and the mystery grew, a shadow lengthening across the years, waiting for the next clue, or none at all. The discovery of $5,800 in rotting $20 bills at Tenna Bar in February 1980 didn't crack the D.B. Cooper case wide open. It lit a fuse, igniting a slow burn of speculation, investigation, and obsession that stretched across decades. By the mid-1980s, the FBI's file on the elusive hijacker had swollen to thousands of pages, a sprawling labyrinth of leads, dead ends, and tantalizing what-ifs that consumed agents, amateur sleuths, and a public hooked on the mystery. The composite sketch, those clip-on sunglasses, that receding hairline, that bland, middle-aged face, stared out from wanted posters, yellowed newspaper clippings, and late-night TV specials, a cipher that could belong to anyone or no one. The $5,800, locked in an evidence vault in Seattle, remained the only tangible relic of the $200,000 ransom, its edges curling like a taunt, while the missing $194,200 haunted the investigation like a phantom limb. Cooper's black tie, his cigarette butts, and the Tenna Bar cash fueled a relentless quest to unmask the man who'd leapt from Flight 305. But each clue only deepened the enigma, turning the case into a hall of mirrors where truth reflected endlessly out of reach. The FBI had vetted over 1,000 suspects by the turn of the century, their lives dissected with a surgical precision that bordered on desperation. Each name carried a story, a glimmer of possibility that flickered briefly before fading into the haze of uncertainty. Kenneth Christensen emerged as a favorite in 2003, pitched by his brother Lyle to a private investigator who'd taken up the Cooper torch. Christensen was a former paratrooper trained in World War II and a Northwest Airlines purser who'd worked the very routes Cooper hijacked. He smoked Raleighs, the brand found on the plane, and bore a passing resemblance to the sketch, though he was shorter, balder, and older than the crew's description. Lyle claimed Ken had bought a house in cash in 1972, a year after the hijacking, despite a modest salary that barely covered his bar tabs. "He told me on his deathbed," Lyle insisted, his voice trembling with conviction. He said, "There's something you should know, but I can't tell you." It was him. The FBI examined Christensen's file, their agents poring over bank records and photos, but found no hard link. No ransom bills, no parachute, just a web of circumstantial threads that unraveled under scrutiny. Richard McCoy Jr. offered a more compelling case. A Vietnam vet and skilled skydiver who hijacked a United Airlines 727 in April 1972, just 5 months after Cooper's leap. McCoy demanded $500,000 in parachutes in a near-identical scheme, jumping over Utah with a cool-headed precision that echoed Cooper's demeanor. He was caught days later, the cash recovered, his fate sealed in a 1974 shootout with police that left him dead at 31. McCoy matched the sketch. 5 feet 10 inches, dark hair, olive skin. And his wife later hinted he'd pulled off an earlier job, a whisper that sent agents scrambling. But McCoy had an alibi. He was in Las Vegas on November 24, 1971, celebrating Thanksgiving with family, a detail corroborated by relatives. Copycat or mastermind? Agents debated, their voices rising over stacks of reports. The similarities were uncanny. The 727, the rear air stare, the calm. But the timeline didn't align, and McCoy's death silenced any confession. He remained a shadow, a mirror to Cooper that reflected too much and too little. Dwayne Weber surfaced in 1995, when his widow, Jo, called the FBI with a story that sent chills down their spines. A career criminal with a rap sheet spanning decades, Weber had whispered, "I'm Dan Cooper," on his deathbed in Florida. His voice a rasp as cancer claimed him. Jo, a soft-spoken woman with a smoker's cough, recounted a nightmare he'd had years earlier, thrashing in his sleep about jumping from a plane, and a used bookstore Bible he'd owned bore a handwritten note, 727 and parachute. Weber had worked near Boeing plants in the 1960s, giving him potential knowledge of the 727's quirks, and his build, 5 feet 11 inches, dark hair, fit the profile. Later lab tests on the tie revealed titanium particles, a rare metal tied to aerospace, but Weber's fingerprints didn't match the plane's smudges, and Jo's memory wavered under questioning. "He wanted me to know," she insisted, clutching a photo of Dwayne in a suit, his eyes hidden behind sunglasses. The FBI dismissed him as another near miss, a tantalizing echo that faded into static. Theories about Cooper's identity spiraled beyond the suspects, a kaleidoscope of possibilities that gripped the public imagination. Was he a Boeing employee, laid off during the company's 1971 downturn, seeking revenge with insider knowledge of the 727's rear air stare? The titanium on the tie pointed to aerospace or manufacturing, a clue that tantalized but led nowhere definitive. Or a CIA operative, testing airline security in a covert op gone rogue. His leap a vanishing act sanctioned by shadows? Some whispered he was a woman in disguise, Florence Schaffner's olive skin comment fueling the notion, though the crew's accounts of his voice and frame debunked it with a shrug. The romantics saw him as a folk hero, a modern Robin Hood who'd outsmarted the system and slipped into obscurity, sipping bourbon under a new name in a sleepy town. "He's the one who got away," a bartender in Ariel mused, pouring a shot for a regular who nodded sagely. The jump itself birthed its own legends, a puzzle of physics and nerve that defied explanation. Cooper's demands, 10,000 feet, unpressurized cabin for parachutes, suggested training, perhaps military. Paratroopers jumped from similar heights, but not in a suit and loafers, not into 200-knot winds and a storm that could shred a man midair. The dummy reserve chute complicated the tale. Had he grabbed it by mistake, plummeting to his doom in a cruel twist? Or ditched it, knowing the civilian chute was enough? His hands steady as he pulled the ripcord? Survivalists argued he'd landed, shed the gear, and hiked out, blending into a nearby town like Woodland or Yakult. His suit swapped for denim and his cash buried in a tin can. Skeptics countered he'd died instantly, tangled in the furs or drowned in the Columbia. The money torn free as he fell, washing up at Tena Bar years later. No one beats that jump, a retired Air Force colonel told Time magazine. He's bones under a tree, mark my words. Science entered the fray in the 2000s, as technology caught up with the case's stubborn silence. The tie, re-examined with electron microscopes, yielded microscopic clues: titanium, aluminum, cerium metals tied to aerospace, chemical plants, or high-tech labs of the 1970s. A citizen sleuth team, led by Tom Kay, a paleontologist turned Cooper obsessive, tested the Tena Bar bills for diatoms, tiny algae from the Columbia, finding springtime species like Asterianella, suggesting the money hit the river months after the jump, not immediately. He survived the night, Kay argued, his voice crackling over a podcast mic, and stashed it later, maybe in a flood zone. The FBI nodded but didn't bite. Their resources stretched thin by newer cases, their interest waning as the trail grew colder. In 2011, a new suspect emerged, Lynn Doyle Cooper, or LD, pitched by his niece Marla Cooper to the FBI with a tale that felt ripped from a novel. Marla, a middle-aged woman with a determined glint, claimed childhood memories of her uncle planning something big in Oregon in 1971. A Korean War vet with parachute skills, LD returned that Thanksgiving bruised and battered, muttering about a job gone wrong, his car reeking of jet fuel. She recalled him with another uncle, sketching maps near a wood stove, and a guitar strap he'd owned bore metal traces like the ties. "It's him," Marla swore, her voice breaking on Good Morning America, tears streaking her face. The FBI tested DNA from the cigarette butts, finally viable after decades, but it didn't match LD's family samples, and the trail fizzled. Another ghost, another echo. Theories and suspects piled up like a house of cards, each built on hope, hunch, and the slimmest of threads. Cooper became a mirror, reflecting whoever gazed into him. A soldier hardened by war, a crook chasing a score, a genius playing chess with the feds, a fool undone by his own daring. The FBI chased shadows across continents, from Canada's backwoods to South America's jungles, their agents knocking on doors in Vancouver, interviewing barflies in Spokane, chasing tips from Rio to Reykjavik. The ties metals hinted at a lab in Pennsylvania, a factory in Seattle, but led to dead ends. Retired machinists with no memory of a man in sunglasses, plant records lost to time. By the 2010s, the case had morphed into a cultural obsession, a riddle that refused to die. Books stacked up in libraries, Skyjack, D.B. Cooper, The Real McCoy, each claiming a piece of the truth. Documentaries aired on cable, their narrators intoning over grainy footage of the 727, the sketch, the riverbank. Amateur sleuths scoured the drop zone with metal detectors, their boots crunching through snow, their dreams of finding the rest of the cache as persistent as the wind. The FBI's file grew to 60 volumes, a monument to frustration, its pages yellowing as leads dried up. "He's out there," Special Agent Larry Carr, who took the case in 2007, told a reporter, his voice weary but resolute. "Or he's not. We may never know." Cooper's identity remained a void, a blank slate filled by 1,000 faces. Was he Christensen, nursing a grudge over a beer? McCoy, perfecting his craft before his fall? Weber, whispering secrets to the grave? Or none of them? A man who'd slipped through history's fingers, his real name lost to the wind? The theories swirled, a storm of their own, but the truth stayed stubbornly out of reach. A shadow dancing on the edge of the forest, a ripple in the Columbia's flow. The hunt had become a quest not just for a man, but for meaning. A chase that led nowhere and everywhere, leaving the world to wonder who D.B. Cooper really was and where he'd gone. On July 8, 2016, the FBI officially closed the book on the D.B. Cooper case, ending a 45-year hunt that had consumed millions of dollars thousands of man-hours, and the careers of agents who'd chased a ghost through the skies and forests of the Pacific Northwest. The announcement came quietly. A press release slipped into the summer news cycle, its words stark and unceremonious. After one of the longest and most exhaustive investigations in our history, the FBI is redirecting resources to other priorities. The file, 60 volumes of interviews, maps, lab reports, and dead ends, sat in a Seattle evidence room, its pages yellowing, its edges curling like the $5,800 in 10-bar bills locked in a vault nearby. The rest of the $200,000, the black tie, the cigarette butts, and Dan Cooper himself remained beyond reach. A riddle unsolved in an age of satellites, DNA, and digital footprints. For the Bureau, it was a surrender to time, but for the world, it was fuel for a legend that refused to fade. Special Agent Frank Montoya Jr., who'd overseen the case's final years, faced the cameras in a Seattle briefing room, his tie knotted tight, his face etched with the weariness of a man who'd inherited a myth. "We've exhausted every lead," he said, his voice steady but tinged with regret. "Unless new, credible evidence emerges, it's time to move on." Behind him, the sketch of Cooper loomed on a screen. Those clip-on sunglasses, that receding hairline, a face that had haunted 3 generations of investigators. The closure wasn't a defeat, Montoya insisted, just pragmatism. The FBI had bigger fish to fry: terrorism, cybercrime, threats that dwarfed a hijacker from 1971. But the words rang hollow to those who'd lived the case. Ralph Himmelsbach, now white-haired and stooped, watching from his Oregon retirement home. Tina Mucklow, living quietly under a new name, her memories of that stormy night locked away. The amateur sleuths who'd scoured the wilderness with shovels and dreams. For them, Cooper wasn't a file to be shelved. He was a question mark etched into the American psyche. The closing didn't kill the story. It set it free. In Ariel, Washington, near the heart of Cooper's drop zone, locals launched D.B. Cooper Days, an annual festival where loggers, retirees, and dreamers gathered under the pines to raise beers to the skyjacker who'd thumbed his nose at the feds. The event swelled each year, its streets lined with vendors hawking T-shirts, "I am D.B. Cooper" in bold red letters, and booths selling bourbon and soda, a nod to his mid-flight drink. Bands strummed folk tunes about the man in the suit, their lyrics weaving tales of parachutes and stormy escapes, while treasure hunters swapped theories over campfires, their eyes glinting with the hope of finding the lost $194,200. "He's our outlaw," a grizzled bartender told a reporter, pouring a shot with a grin. "Took the money and ran. Damn the man." The romance of it all painted Cooper as a folk hero, a shadow who danced with danger and won, a middle finger to authority in an era of Vietnam, Watergate, and distrust. But Cooper's legacy stretched beyond barstool ballads and small-town fairs. It reshaped the skies themselves. The hijacking of Flight 305 exposed a gaping hole in aviation security, a vulnerability that echoed through the industry like a thunderclap. The Boeing 727's rear air stair, once a quirky feature for quick loading at rural airports, became a liability overnight, a backdoor Cooper had kicked wide open. Within months, Boeing engineers designed the Cooper vane, a simple latch that locked the air stair mid-flight, its metal clank a quiet tribute to the man who'd forced their hand. Airlines scrambled to tighten protocols. Metal detectors sprouted at gates, bag checks became routine, and the freewheeling days of air travel, where you could stroll aboard with a cigarette and a smile, faded into memory. "He showed us the cracks," an FAA official admitted years later, his voice wry. "We sealed them, but we lost something too." Hijacking spiked post-1971. Copycats like Richard McCoy testing the skies. But the net closed fast, security a cage forged in Cooper's shadow. The treasure hunters never stopped, their boots crunching through the snow and mud of southwestern Washington, their metal detectors buzzing like cicadas. The forest yielded bones: deer, bear, a fox skull bleached white, but never human, never Cooper's. The Columbia River stayed mute, its currents a graveyard of secrets, its banks picked clean by decades of searchers. The money's absence gnawed at them. $194,200 unspent. a fortune too big to vanish without a trace. "It's out there," a grizzled prospector told National Geographic in 2015. His beard streaked with gray, his shovel scarred from years of digging. "Under a rock, in a hollow log. I'll find it." Others saw Cooper as a survivor, sipping piña coladas on a Belize beach or tending a farm in Idaho. His loot buried under a barn, his sunglasses swapped for a straw hat. "He's too smart to get caught," a woman in a Seattle coffee shop mused, stirring her latte. "He's watching us chase our tails." Theories lingered like smoke, curling around the edges of the case, refusing to dissipate. Himmelsbach, his voice raspy with age, stuck to his guns in a 2016 interview, his hands trembling as he gripped a cane. "He died out there," he said, his eyes fixed on a photo of the drop zone. "No one beats that jump. 10,000 feet, 200-knot winds, a storm like that. He's bones under a pine, and the money's scattered." But Tina Mucklow, in a rare 2011 statement, disagreed, her words soft but firm. "He knew too much," she said, her voice a whisper from a life rebuilt far from the spotlight. "The altitude, the parachutes, the plane, he had a plan. I don't think he died." The tie's microscopic clues, titanium, cerium, metals tied to aerospace or labs, hinted at a man with a technical past. But the FBI shelved them as inconclusive, their labs turning to fresher mysteries. Citizen sleuths like Tom Kay kept the flame alive, their homemade labs buzzing with experiments that rivaled the bureau's. Kay's diatom tests on the Tennebar bills, finding springtime algae, suggested the money hit the river months after the jump, not immediately, painting a picture of a survivor who'd stashed his haul and lost a piece to nature. "He made it through the night," Kay told a documentary crew, his voice crackling with conviction. His charts spread across a cluttered desk. The wind data, the chute. He knew what he was doing. Others mapped wind patterns from November 24, 1971, their models tracing a landing zone wider than Victor 23, stretching toward the Cascades or the coast. The dummy chute fueled debate. Had he grabbed it by mistake or ditched it? His hands steady on the civilian canopy as he sailed into the dark, Cooper became a cultural mirror, reflecting the dreams and fears of each era. In the 1970s, he was a rebel, a lone wolf defying a system buckling under war and scandal. By the 1980s, he was a ghost story, a cautionary tale of hubris and greed. The 2000s cast him as a puzzle, a cold case for a digital age obsessed with closure. Songs mourned him, the Ballad of D.B. Cooper, its chords plucked on barroom guitars, while bars named drinks after him, bourbon and soda with a twist of mystery, their coasters stamped with his sketch. "He's our outlaw," a Seattle bartender grinned, pouring one for a regular who toasted the air. "Hero or villain?" a 2011 Time article asked, its pages wrestling with the duality. "Both," it concluded. A man who risked 42 lives but spared them, a bomb that might have been real or a bluff too bold to call. What happened to him? Did he soar to freedom, a mastermind laughing from a hammock as the feds flailed? His cash spent in shadows or buried in a vault of his own making? Or plummet to his doom, a fool undone by arrogance, his bones bleaching under the pines, his loot scattered by wind and water? The truth danced out of reach, a shadow in the storm that defied every net cast to snare it. Maybe he'd planned it that way. Dan Cooper, misheard as DB by a reporter's slip, a name that stuck like glue to a legend. He didn't just hijack a plane. He hijacked a nation's imagination, leaving behind a void that begged to be filled. The forest of Victor 23 grew thicker with time, its roots curling deeper, its silence a wall against the world. The Columbia flowed on, its waters cold and unyielding, its secrets locked in depths no diver could plumb. The $5,800 sat in evidence, a relic of a heist that defied logic, while the rest, $194, $200, remained a siren's call, luring hunters into the wild. Himmelsbach died in 2023, his last words a gruff "he's gone." His eyes still searching the horizon. Kay kept digging, his maps and microscopes a testament to a faith that never wavered. The FBI moved on, its agents chasing new shadows, but the public didn't. The case lived in podcasts, forums, barroom bets, a story too good to let die. D.B. Cooper vanished into thin air, a man who stepped off a plane and into eternity. Was he a genius, a lunatic, a hero, a corpse? The answers lay somewhere in the vast, untamed dark. Perhaps under a tree, perhaps in a bar in Mexico, perhaps nowhere at all. He left us chasing a ghost through the thin air of memory, a riddle with no solution, a legacy that whispered. Some mysteries are meant to endure, unsolved, eternal, free.